In this video, we will discuss how we can use Valuate interactive APIs to work with active data in a workspace. We will also walk through the process of taking the request URLs from the interactive API client to reuse in Postman. The agenda is to give an overview to use common functionalities in interactive API and reuse them in Postman for activities like authentication and using REST APIs to perform actions on single or multiple defects. Actions like deleting, updating, creating, and getting information will be discussed in this session. So first, let's begin with authentication. For authentication, we require API keys, for which we can go to Valuate platform and we'll need to go to the settings and the spaces. We'll need to go to the shared space level and then go to the API access tab. So here we can create the new API by selecting the Add API Access option. Then enter the required information like the name, when the API key will expire. We can select the roles and also the workspace for which we would like to perform these actions by using these API key authentication keys. Once the required fields are filled in, we can click on the Add button and then we'll get the API keys information. We can copy this across for using them later. So first, let's begin with authentication in the interactive API client. The API client can be accessed by selecting the interactive API client option. So once we are in the interactive API client, we need to enter the client ID and the client secret ID that we have obtained from the API key access UI and log into the interactive API client. Now let's look at authentication in Postman. So I'm creating a post request with the authentication sign-in URL. In the header, I'm entering the content type as application JSON, and in the body, I'm entering the client ID and the secret ID, and I click on send. And this will say the 200 OK status, which says that the authentication has been successful. Now let's look at how to select the right workspace that we need to work in. In Interactive API, the workspace icon will provide the list of workspaces that the API key has access to, and we can select the right workspace we are working on. With regards to Postman, the shared space ID and the workspace ID are mentioned in the URL that can be used in the Postman to work on the right workspace and the shared space. So in the Interactive Client API, select the generic APIs or the CI/CD APIs, depending on the requirements. Under Octane, we can select the entities and the operations to query. Interactive API Client allows us to do operation against multiple entities as well as a single entity using the GUI interface provided under each operation. So examples in the Postman will be using the request URL provided in the Interactive API Client window. More information regarding the REST API resources is also available in our Help Center. Now let's begin with our first example to delete multiple defects by specifying a query, for which I select the delete multiple defects option, and here I need to enter a query with the IDs of the defects I want to delete. So let's go back to value edge Octane and get the IDs. So I select 2350 and 2351. The shared space and the workspace IDs gets populated by itself, and I can click on execute. And can see the response is 200. That means the entities have been successfully deleted. I can go back to value edge Octane, refresh to see that the IDs of the defects or the defects have been deleted. Some notes with regards to this query. For more information on how to build the query, do refer to our help center, which provides more information on this. For the query itself, use double quotes. The query is case sensitive. If you are unsure of the defects, you can use the get operation to get the field name and more information of the defects that are being deleted. The spaces and the special characters used in these queries are replaced by %20, %22, and similar alternatives to encode the URL that is being sent. You can use this request URL from the interactive API client and run it against Postman. In Postman, I'm creating a new request for multiple delete option for the defects. I'm selecting the delete functionality and selecting defects 255 and 256. And this shows that the request was successful. I can go back to Octane or Value Edge and check and see that these two defects have been deleted successfully. In our next example, we'll look at getting the list of defects and displaying the IDs and phase fields. Filter list to include only defects where the phase is new, and limit the number of items to display to 2 items starting from an offset of 10. We will also order the list by the defect ID. In the interactive API client, to display the defects, a GET request is needed. The result of the GET request depends on the following parameters. First, we need the fields, which will be included in the result. Then we need the query statement to filter the collection. I'll be using this query. To find out more about how to write the queries, do refer to our help center with the details. Then we need to specify the page size in the query and offset on where to start the page. Sort the order of the entities to display by the field in the order by. Then we can execute the query. So here we see the results for the two defects, which is 2553 and 2581, and we see that the phase is new. Value edge. We can see that the defect has a new status. In Postman, we can use this request URL to get the information. And in Postman, we see that these two defects have been returned as a result. and these phases are new. Next example is to create two defects with phase as new and assign them to a release and a sprint. In the interactive API client, to create multiple defects, a post request is needed. The post request needs to have a body that specifies the properties of the defects to be submitted. Here is an example of a request body in JSON format that can be entered to create defects field. We will use the code and execute the query. Now this has created two defects, 5001 and 5002. So here we can see that the defect has been created and it has been assigned to the demo release and sprint 1 and has populated the detected by field. In Postman, we can use the request URL add the content type as application JSON and in the body populate the same query that we had used in the interactive API. And this creates defect 6001 and 6002. In our next example, we will be updating multiple defects by changing the phase to rejected. In the interactive API client, to update multiple defects, a put request is needed. The put request needs to have a body that specifies the properties of the defects to be updated. Since multiple defects need to be updated, a filter condition needs to be provided in the query field. We will use the query which specifies the defect IDs that needs to be updated and a request body in JSON format that can be entered in the defect update field. And execute. And we see that the defects phase has been updated to rejected. In Postman, we can use the requested URL we can change the defect IDs that are being used as they're already updated. Update the body with the JSON code. And we see that these two defects have been updated. In our next example, we'll see on how to delete a single defect. In the interactive API client, we use the delete functionality to delete a single defect. Here, we require the defect ID that needs to be deleted and we click on execute. And the response shows that the operation has been successful. And if we refresh, we do not see 6001 any longer. For Postman, we can use the request URL that is available in the interactive API. Delete, enter the URL, change to a different defect ID as the old one has already been deleted. And we get 200 OK. We can go to value edge and see that 6002 has been deleted. In our next example, we'll see on how to get one defect and display the ID and face field. In the interactive API client, to display a defect, a GET request is needed. Enter the defect ID in the entity UUID field. In the fields, enter ID and face and execute. And we get the details of the defect fields that has been selected. In Postman, we can use the requested URL used in the interactive API. And send. And this will give us the details of the defect. In this last example, we'll show you on how to update one defect by changing the face to rejected. In the interactive API client, to update one defect, we need to use the put request. The put request needs to have a body that specifies the properties of the defects to be updated. Only one defect needs to be updated, so we enter the defect ID in the entity UID. And we update the request body in JSON format. And execute the API. And we see that 3090 has been updated. 3090, which was new, has been updated to rejected. In Postman, we use the requested URL and the body. Change the defect ID. And send the request. It says that the defect has been updated. And we see that the face of this defect has been updated. In Marketplace, we have ALM Octane Postman Collection Pack for REST APIs, which includes the get, post, put, and delete request. This can be used in your Postman, which has predefined requests along with parameters that can be used for the REST API requests. Hope you found the session with regards to interactive API client and Postman useful. Thank you for your time.